Okay, in this video we're going to look at the whole area of specialization and trade, and we're going to look at the benefits and the drawbacks or disadvantages of those. And this would be a typical essay where it asks possibly, is trade always beneficial? Or it could be an essay which asks whether maybe tariffs should be put on trade, or whether there should be some sort of restriction on trade. And so you've got to use some of these arguments in that sort of essay, where you're saying, well, actually, if you restrict trade, then you lose these benefits, but you will gain, as it were, the drawbacks in that sense. So hopefully this will give you a good idea of how to set that out. So remember, if it's an essay, you're looking for 3 points. It could be a 12 marker or a 15 marker as well, in which case you're either looking for sort of 2 or 3 points there. So how I would split this up, I think, is I would be looking for the benefits of trade here. The first sort of benefits of trade are the benefits for the consumers, which are all of those 4 points there. So let's just zoom in on there. So your first benefit, you've really got to be able to come up very quickly with the idea of comparative advantage theory, and you need to be able to say that the consumption possibility boundary lies beyond the production possibility boundary. In other words, there can be more goods and services consumed when you specialize in trade than if you didn't specialize in trade. And you need to go to the comparative advantage video if you want to make sure you get that sorted out as well, please. So you really need a good, strong paragraph there. So consumers are better off, their living standards are higher because they can consume beyond the production possibility. You could add in, there's some goods that they won't be able to consume if they don't trade. They get more choice if there's trade because they can be buying from different countries. And also that if you increase your openness to trade, then it's going to lower your prices. So for consumers, there'll be a rise in real income and a rise in their consumer surplus. Now, if you don't get that, you need to go to the video that I've done on the microeconomic effects of opening up to trade. But I'm just going to bring in, this is the diagram that you need to be looking at in that particular case, where you just show, for example, you have the home supply curve, the home demand curve, and then you bring in the world supply curve down here. And so this red line becomes the supply curve. And what you're arguing is that for the consumer, the price is lower, and so their real incomes are higher. And this area here is going to be the area, this area here, the area of an increase in their consumer surplus. So if you don't get that, you need to go to watch that video. There's a video just on that whole area. So the first point I would be making is that for the consumer, openness to trade and specialization is a beneficial thing. I then bring in the next thing, which another benefit, which is, and it's a really important economic point, is that trade is the engine of economic growth. So not only will trade lead to export-led growth, that's on the demand side, but also there'll be an increase in productivity, increase in efficiency, which increases the long-run supply side growth of the economy. In other words, you've got a supply side idea coming through, and you'll see in a minute why that is when we look at these economies of scale. But before we do that, I just want to show you what the World Bank have said recently, which again gives you some application for this. The World Bank is a group which helps countries to access world markets. It opens up trade, basically. And what they have said is that trade is an engine of growth, creates better jobs, reduces poverty, increases opportunity. Their research has shown that when you liberalize, when you free up a country and they get into international trade, they open the economy to trade, then the growth of that country has grown on average 1 to 1.5% percentage points. So over 10 years here, after a decade, that's going to lead to 10 to 20% higher income. There's other stuff here that they say which is useful, but you've really got to be able to show that trade is an engine of growth. It's a very important economic point. Okay, now, why is that? Let's have a look at this. Several reasons really in terms of the supply side. Firstly, you've got the idea of internal economies. That is that when you open up your country, when firms start to specialize, as they do under comparative advantage theory, the firms are going to get larger. That's going to give them internal economies of scale. You'll learn that in microeconomics. It'll basically mean that they have lower unit costs. They become more efficient. Their productivity rises, which leads to long-run supply side growth. Just want to show you at this point a couple of countries that might help you. Here's the country Malaysia, and you can see from this little snippet here, Malaysia has diversified. It was agriculture, commodity based, but now it's a robust manufacturing and service sector industry, and it's a leading exporter. It's one of the most open economies, so this is a really good example to use for openness to international trade. And what it says, it has been instrumental in employment creation, income growth. 40% of Malaysian jobs are linked to the export activities. That's meant that their growth has been 5.4%. Good application, I hope. Good country to have a look at. But also, let's have a look at one in Sub-Saharan Africa. And Sub-Saharan Africa here has got its problems, but here's a country, Mauritius, and its exports are sugar and textiles. But what it says is that it can be a strong instrument for achieving the MDGs. MDGs are the Millennium Development Goals of that country. And one of the key things here is that in Mauritius, they've allowed the country, it says, to adapt international competition and develop value-added services. In other words, they've moved through the chain. Instead of just producing sugar, they're also using the sugar in the manufacturing process in Mauritius. Really important that they do that so that there's a much more greater value added to the services and to the companies in Mauritius, i.e. they've moved through the supply chain. They're not just basic sugar suppliers, they're actually doing something with it. So you'll learn more about that later on when you do development economics. Okay. Big company, I think, or country rather, that you should be considering is, of course, Cambodia. Now, just give you some information here to start with. It says Cambodia here has undergone significant transition. It's reached lower middle income status, and it's even going for upper middle income status. And the key thing is it's driven by garment exports and tourism. And you can see 7.7% growth. So you can see that opening themselves up to trade has enabled them to grow very rapidly. Now, in that, here's an example. This is more information about Cambodia that you could use. The garment industry, 16% of GDP, but 80% of their export earnings are really specialized in the garment industry, 589 factories. Now, let's have a look. I'm going to show you now a graphic, and it's a typical graphic that you can get if you look on the internet. This is Cambodia. What is it exporting? Well, it's exporting sweaters, knitwear. Okay, knitwear, t-shirts. It's very, very sort of big exporter of clothing. And even if you look now at your a label in a cloth, you'll often see that it's made in Cambodia. So this is a good give you some good information about Cambodia. And the key thing really is that they are enjoying these internal economies. So as that Cambodian industry grows, it's each individual company is enjoying internal economies of scale. But on the other hand, we also need to consider external economies of scale. Now, what it says here is in Cambodia, 60% of those factories are either within or in close proximity to their capital, Phnom Penh. And this leads us to consider what we call external economies of scale. That is when the industry as a whole grows. So internal is when the firm grows. External is when industries grow together. They become big hubs of manufacturing hubs, and they then also get lower unit costs because of what you're going to learn in micro, what we call external economies of scale. A couple of more things that you could bring up if you wanted to for, the benefits is that you get an exchange of ideas, which we call intellectual property processes, i.e. if there's foreign direct investment, when they specialize and they open their economies up, then new international firms bring new ideas in. And also in terms of some low-income countries, they can earn some foreign exchange. They can actually sell. So Cambodia can sell their their knitwear, and they're earning international currency, which they can then use to buy raw materials and buy life-sustaining goods, medicines, and that sort of thing. So two big reasons, and I would be putting that as one of my main points, I suppose, in an essay. Consumers are better off and the economy is better off because you're going to get higher economic growth. But of course, there's going to be some drawbacks. Now, which ones would we concentrate on? Well, let's have a look at them. The first ones here, I think you could lump these together. The idea is that sometimes you get infant industries, young industries that need to be protected. So opening up to trade is not going to be beneficial to those. And also industries that go into decline, that sometimes if they're in decline, they stay open. You need to enable them to change because they stay open if you can avoid trading and specializing so that it gives them a chance to adapt and maybe recover. But, again, a drawback is that with specialization and trade, that you can over-specialize. And so Cambodia, for example, if it over-specialized in knitwear, and there's a decline in the knitwear industry, a reduction in demand for knitwear in the world economy, then it's going to be problematic for it. So that's one of the things. Second thing I think you need to remember, one of the assumptions of comparative advantage here is that the factors can move, so that the industry that has a comparative advantage, you start to specialize in that industry. And the assumption is that it moves from the other industry, that labor moves across, and you're going to get jobs in the industry that you're specializing in. But in reality, that doesn't always happen, and that you can get structural unemployment or regional unemployment occurring as well. So that can be another drawback of trade. Inequality is a big drawback of trade, in the sense that very often there's some countries that are much more dominant than others. So it is argued that developed countries will dominate the developing countries, and so it increases inequality in the world. I think a big one, which possibly you really must mention, I would say, in any essay, is this increased movement of goods is going to cause negative pollution and emissions externalities. I'm just going to show you an article. This is an older article, I know that, but it's from the Evening Standard. This is when Young's, company that makes farms prawns, decided they're going to ship 600 tons of prawns over to Thailand, and they're going to shell them, and then they're going to repackage them and ship them back to the factory where they began their journey, i.e. they're going to be caught or farmed, if you like, in Scotland. They're going to be sent over to Thailand. They were going to be shelled by hand, and then they're going to be sent back to Scotland. Well, they'll be breaded and sold across the UK. And obviously, there's a problem with jobs lost in Scotland, but the biggest problem was the big environmental damaging consequences that was going to cause. So that's a good argument for not having such long chains of supply. And again, with the COVID that's been happening, I think you could argue that as well. So two more things really, or one more thing just to finish off. Specialization can lead, if you've got a specialization, you get bigger companies. Bigger companies lead to monopolies. So hopefully that gives you a pretty good idea of how to set out an essay. I would be saying there's benefits to consumers, there's benefits to economic growth on the supply side as well, and explain some of those, bring in some examples, and pick up a few of the drawbacks, mainly the idea of pollution externalities and emissions as these goods are going across the world economies. So hopefully that gives you a good idea.